Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, reaching for his ripcord and realizing it's not there, Scott. It's not there.
I actually took it away.
I thought so. It's like spy versus spy. Well, you won.
Well, finally. All it took was 5 years.
I know, right?
I spied really hard, I finally did it.
That's right. You were triumphant at last.
Well, speaking of triumphant at last, this is the last week of July Who Loved Me, our 5th birthday celebration of 1977's Roger Moore James Bond film, The Spy Who Loved Me, and it's our final interview, and we thought we'd go out on a high.
That's right, an all-time high.
Wrong
Taking
film.
it back to Octopussy. Yes, as you said, the wrong film. But nonetheless, it truly was an all-time high.
It really was.
And that's right. We are here this week to talk to Rick Sylvester, who is the skier and climber who performed the Spy Who Loved Me parachute jump. I hesitate to call him a stuntman for reasons we'll get to in the interview.
Sure.
But he did pull off this iconic stunt, as well as another one we might talk about later.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of iconic James Bond moments, if you're making a Mount Rushmore of moments or Mount Rushmore of Roger Moore Bond moments, perhaps, I think this stunt would be on there.
Yes.
And he is the man behind it. It was his advertisement in a magazine that made it happen. But we'll get into all of those stories. Without further ado, let's unveil the Union Jack flag and let the Bond theme tinkle along in the background. Here it is, Mr. Rick Sylvester. Joining us on the show to continue our celebration of The Spy Who Loved Me, he's the man behind arguably, and I would argue on the side of this, the greatest stunt ever featured in a spy movie. It can't be overstated. Joining us is the one and only Mr. Rick Sylvester. Hello, Rick. How are you?
Very good, Scott. Nice to hear that praise.
Well, it's earned, I would say. And we're going to talk about The Spy Who Loved Me, but we're also going to talk about For Your Eyes Only that you also worked on, and just sort of your career and things that you worked on. And I think the first question, and usually what we ask people, because we have a lot of writers and actors and directors on the show, and the first question is always, what made you want to get into the film industry? But you weren't in the film industry. You were a mountaineer. You're climbing, all sorts of activities before you even got involved in The Spy Who Loved Me. So I suppose the question is for you, where did that love of climbing come from?
Well, let me back up a bit. That's a good question. Some time ago, someone told me that I was listening to Wikipedia, and I looked it up, and it said I was an iconic stuntman, an iconic Hollywood stuntman. Well, in 1954, when I was 12, my folks moved to Beverly Hills, which is next to West LA, which is next to it was next to West Hollywood, which is next to Hollywood. That's the closest I ever came to becoming a Hollywood stuntman. I only did 2 stunts in my life, the 2 Bond movies. Aside from that's my film CV. Aside from some interviews for documentaries and so on, and things like this podcast. Talk about starting at the top. So I never considered myself a stuntman per se. Admittedly, I did the 2 Bond stunts. Sociology 1A, we play many roles in life, and I did play the role stuntman. A stunt person is more PC these days, but I never regarded myself as a stuntman. I got into climbing and skiing. I'm not sure why. They say that things like adventure, you don't choose, you're chosen by it. And my senior year of secondary school, I forgot what you call it. In Europe and Britain, they call it high school. I made my first ski trip. That was 1959. And then I got into climbing, and I don't really remember exactly why. And the reason I got the Bond job was I was the only one to do what became known as a ski base jump.
Hmm.
I was not a stunt person per se. And it's interesting, when you talk about something that happened so long ago, everything is lines. It's hard to come up with anything new. But a couple of months ago at the local climbing gym, an acquaintance came up to me and said, "You're not the first to do a ski base jump." This was quite a blow because that was one of my claims to fame. For a few years, I was listed in the Guinness Book of Superlatives. We call it the Guinness Book of Records here. But a friend of mine had the original edition, the Guinness Book of Superlatives.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought that was unusual because if you're the only one to do something, it isn't that difficult to be listed there. But anyway, he said, "You're not the first." And it took me aback. And then he said, "An Austrian did before you, but he lost his life." So I guess I'm the first to do a ski base jump who survived. And there's something to be said for that. Anyway, so that was the reason I got the work, because I was the only one to do it and have survived. And at the end of working on Spy Who Loved Me, I mentioned, I forgot to whom it was, Cubby Broccoli or some other higher up at Neon Productions in the Bond hierarchy, that if you ever have a climbing scene in a future Bond film, please keep me in mind. There was a rumor circulating around that the only Disney film that ever lost money centered around climbing. I was looking this up the other day. There were two Disney films. One starred Spencer Tracy with, I think, Robert Young. I'm forgetting. There was another one. And the idea that Hollywood was averse to climbing, someone who doesn't ski or snowboard could understand the appeal. It's like a dance going down. But climbing in general is very slow. Internally, it's very exciting, but visually it isn't, with one exception, of course, and that's falling. So, of course, there was a big fall.
Right.
Anyway, that's why I got the work in For Your Eyes Only. And I wasn't the world's best climber. Maybe you don't want the world's best climbers. They're too smart, too intelligent to do things like that giant fall I took. But, and I know we're jumping ahead to For Your Eyes Only, but a couple of years ago, I actually had a new insight. I always felt that both stunts, were really not that difficult. I really thought that gravity deserved an equal or maybe a greater credit. And the fall in For Your Eyes Only was even simpler than what I did in The Spy Who Loved Me. Of course, in both cases, if you messed up, you could lose your life. So anyway, a couple of years ago, it struck me why I was so worried about taking that big fall. And it didn't have to be as big as it was, but that's another story. And I realized when I did what became known as a ski base jump in The Spy Who Loved Me, I'd done it 3 times before. I'd never done a huge fall in climbing, which I was very conservative, and I was very proud of that. So maybe that's one reason it worried me until it was over in the can.
Okay. Well, I had a couple questions before we get to Bond, and there's a lot to dive into there, but were you always an adventurous kid? Because, the sports you're involved in are things that people like myself get very nervous about.
I collect sayings and quotes. I have a little yellow book. And one I came across not that long ago, I think it was for Somerset Maugham, your countryman, who's, the greatest writer of short stories in the English language, including a few novels.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote is, adventure may be risky, but routine is fatal. And that's right now, that's a lot of what my life consists of. Again, the lovely aging process. But I never liked the risk of it. That was just a necessary part of adventure. But I was driven to adventure and things like climbing and so on, skiing. I was an indifferent athlete. In high school, I did 3 sports. I was on, American football. I was on the second string on the B team. I was mostly a bench sitter, which I hated. And then track and field, I was a pole vaulter. The first sport I was better than average was wrestling, maybe because we had weight classes. And that gave me a lot of confidence. So when I got into climbing, rather than wrestling with guys, you might say wrestling with, crags and mountains, I had a lot of confidence due to my wrestling career. I was not world class, but I had some key victories, including winning the national championships the year I did a year of graduate study in Stockholm, Sweden, and winning a conference actually in the States here, which is actually more difficult. Internationally, there's two types of wrestling, freestyle and Greco-Roman. And what we do in the States is most similar to freestyle. And anyway, lost my train of thought, which happens a lot these days.
Well, I think you answered the question there, that you were someone just drawn to that sense of adventure. And that is actually kind of leads into my next question, which is when we talk to people typically on the show, we're talking to a lot of actors, directors, writers, things like that in the film industry. And we always ask them a question of, at what point did Bond enter your life? But for you, were you someone who was actually interested in movies? Were you watching films? Were you aware of Bond in a big way when you were tasked to do the James Bond work?
Well, everyone loves movies. I mean, I should qualify that. Almost everyone. And what happened in the case of Bond, it must have been early 70s. And I just got an unemployment, what you call being on the dole. I was signing up for unemployment insurance.
Mm-hmm.
The reason I wrote down, it was the end of the ski season. I'd been on the ski patrol here in what used to be called Squaw Valley. They changed the name because supposedly it was not PC for the Native American tribes. And I wrote down as the reason I was applying for being on the dole was the snow melted. And then about that time, I got a phone call and it said, "This is London calling. And my name is Cubby Broccoli, like the broccoli seed." That's an exact quote. And listening in on me. And I wish I'd jotted that down because I'd forgotten that I could make a couple of guesses who it was. I'd never had a conference call in my life. I'd never had a transatlantic call. And the question was, would you be interested in doing that thing you did? I'd done a magazine advert, which actually was due to the helicopter pilot not landing atop Mount Asgard above the Arctic Circle. It was faked. They took my Mountain Drive Nikon, a Nikon shot, superimposed against the mountains of Baffin Island. It was intended to be done, but the helicopter pilot didn't think he had enough flying experience to land atop the peak, which is probably as big as a soccer field, as you could say a football field. But anyway, so it's faked. And I admit that in an interview with a newspaper writer, but before it was pulled out of the magazines, the Bond people saw it. It wasn't in the book. The only Ian Fleming book that actually had a climbing scene was in Her Majesty's Secret Service. It was added to The Spy Who Loved Me. So anyway, I was asked if I'd be willing to do that again. And it wasn't because I was a huge Bond fan. I've never been every opening of a Bond, it used to be there was a new Bond film every 2 years. And then the length got longer. And then, of course, we have the present difficulties with Amazon taking over, getting access to the whole MGM catalog of films. Anyway, I said, sure. It was great, though I had certain misgivings afterwards. In a way, that was a key moment, being asked to do it. But then the piper had to be paid.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And so, what were the initial conversations? They offered this opportunity to you, but you're saying it was staged. Was there any sort of misgiving of going I don't know, or was it like you know what, let's do it?
No, I'm a person who's always second guessed himself. My intention when I came up, I was actually working construction in Hawaii in the Pacific Ocean. My dad was part owner of a construction company, and I was working as a carpenter apprentice and a laborer. He wanted me to learn the business from the ground up. If I had a hammer in my hand, I wanted to be hitting pitons back in those days. And I was having these vivid dreams. I'd never been in, I did my formative years in Southern California, but I'd never been in a truly tropical environment. The last few years, I was more used to spending my nights in a sleeping bag rather than under a couple of thin sheets like in Hawaii. And that's when I got this weird idea of skiing off El Capitan in an iconic crag in Yosemite National Park. And I was having these vivid dreams, and one of them was skiing off El Cap. The parachute, which made it possible, idea came a couple years later. But I'd spent a lot of time in El Cap doing overnight climbs besides short climbs at its base. And a key moment came. That would have been the winter of 1969. A couple years later, I asked for time off from ski school to go down to the San Francisco Bay Area and attend a parachute, learn how to parachute jump. That had been. I have actually lists on my to-do list. The three main ones right now are climbs to do, books to read, and films to see. And as someone cleverer than I observed, there comes a time when you have to get realistic and move things from your bucket list to your bucket list. I've never been very reasonable. And most of the things on my climbing list were things that would have been at the limits of my ability back then. So anyway, skydiving was on my to-do list. But now the idea was to learn how to put into this crazy idea of skiing off a almost 3,000 foot high cliff. I could not believe that I was making the first step into realizing this ridiculous thing. And I went down to the city and during the 3-week period made about 50 skydiving jumps. Even back then, people had done thousands. And then afterwards, I hiked to the top of El Cap, but it was too late in the season. The snow had melted way back from the edge. It would have been quite a shoveling job to make a ramp of snow leading to the edge. So the idea was put on hold for a year, and anyone in their proper mind would have had time to reflect and give up on the idea. The only difference between a madman and myself is that I'm not mad. I'm going to use that line to describe myself. So anyway, my initial idea was just to do it. No publicity, no photography, no cine cameras, just to do it as an outdoor adventure. But with the year that elapsed, it gave me time to think, this is too visual, too good not to film. And some people heard about what I was planning. We're making what became known as a ski porn movie. You know, you get a bunch of spectacular skiing. There's no real storylines to those. And that my scene could be the thing which made their little production. So anyway, we went down to Yosemite and I did the thing, but the camera crew that was hired, no one wanted to stand right at the edge of the cliff. So they captured my run to the edge and then I disappeared. That rather than going off almost a 3,000 foot cliff, it may have been a 15-foot cliff. So I realize now that the photography, I mean, this is more than just the search for the perfect camera angle. That had become important. My initial intention was to do this only one time as an adventure. But a couple of weeks later, I was in Southern California attending a branch of the American Alpine Club. And I met the guys who'd worked on the desert sequence of Clint Eastwood's movie, The Eiger Sanction.
Yeah.
Where to solve the mystery of the book, it was based on a book written by a professor whose pseudonym was Trevanian. For some reason, he never wanted his real name used in the book. The idea is Clint Eastwood has to get back in climbing shape. So he's climbing a very unusual, it's considered the thinnest, tallest rock formation. It's called the Totem Pole in the Navajo Reservation in, I believe, Arizona, not Utah. And I met the guys who were at the American Alpine Club section meeting who'd done the filming on that. They didn't do the primary filming on the Eiger in Switzerland. And so 2 weeks later, using guys not only were cameramen and sound and so on that, but were climbers, I did a second jump. And that was the only good one where I didn't land in a tree because I was a somewhat experienced climber and experienced skier. I was and remain to this day a novice skydiver. Only 80 jumps logged in my climbing logbook. I mean, my parachuting logbook. So, and then a year later, I broke my own rules. There was one shot that could be gotten with the camera looking in, which in those days meant there's only one option, a helicopter. Now, of course, you have drones, which are far cheaper. And I did it for a third time. And that time was totally bollocks. We were shooting into the sun. It turned out the camera in the helicopter wasn't working. It was a complete disaster. And this time I hit a tree twice as high as the one on the first jump, where the chute hooked right over the top, which is what you want to do. With me, it happened just by luck, not by skill. The third jump, where I hit the tree that was twice as high, maybe over 100 feet tall, a pine tree on the edge of the meadow, the only suitable place to land, which had happened on the second jump, the successful one. I thought it was fine. Then I clipped this tree, and as soon as you slow down, the parachute collapses. And I was grabbing for branches at the top, but everything was breaking. And then I fell, I don't know how many feet, 70 feet. I ended up on the second to last branch, the bottom 40 feet that went on. It probably would have killed me, but the chute hooked. Again, not due to any skill on my part, due to luck. And so those were the three predecessors in Yosemite. And then I got the call for asking if I was interested in the Bond film. And but I was plagued, I come from a period when you had a complete separation between amateur and professional. It used to be very strong with you can only have amateurs competing in the Olympics, and then they had the term amateurism. You had Russian athletes, officers, who were being, all they did really was train for the sport. It wasn't fair to compete for these people who were training year round, who technically were amateurs, but not really. But I came from that era that was purism versus doing something. So the idea now, it was the Bond film was definitely adventure. In some ways, it was more of an adventure due to the location above the Arctic Circle than in Yosemite. But I actually had worries. I was doing it for filthy lucre, for money. And that actually worried me. I was getting superstitious, you might say, because this is going to be jump number 4 now. But it wasn't just purely for adventure. It was also, for profit.
Sure. But the fact that you were paid for it, I think is good in the sense because you're putting your life at risk, and you only plan to do it the once, and by that point you're already at 3 times. This would be a 4th, and the risks involved of doing a jump like that, I'm sure, are untold. So, I think doing it for money is probably the best way of doing it because at least there's an incentive there. Otherwise, you're just taking your life into your own hands every time.
I hear what you're saying, but it wasn't just purely for adventure, though.
No, I know.
What happened while we were up there, we were up there for 2 weeks. The first week, we practiced things. I was familiar with the Yosemite setting, but, here you have issues like wind, which, if the wind blows you back in the peak, Mount Asgard, which is a very dramatic rock tower, you're in trouble. So they'd seen my 16 millimeter footage of the El Cap jumps, and they practiced, you call them smoke pots, we call them smoke bombs, throwing those, or even snowballs off the top, setting up camera locations. They actually had a very similar setup to what I had in Yosemite. Not probably now there'd be 8 cameras, but only 3 cameras. There was one which was supposed to be the master shot on the helicopter, which it's out in space. I'm skiing towards it, kind of tangential. there was a camera on a little lens below me with a wide angle lens. That would be just for a little edit in. And then there's a camera on the side of the cliff to my right, which would see me going into space, going down the run to the edge and going into space, and then deploying the Union Jack designed parachute. But the master shot was supposed to be the helicopter. And anyway, I spent a week figuring out camera locations, deciding what to do. And I became a bit worried because, again, it's summer, but this is above the Arctic Circle by a few miles. And I read somewhere that up there, a quarter of the time, the weather's good. A quarter of the time, it's horrendous. And maybe half the time, it's what they call a Scottish mist, drizzling and so on. Mm-hmm. So we had this week of good weather. And I got a little worried that we're squandering good weather. And sure enough, it started raining. And so nothing was happening. And who knows how long that was going to last. And then it was I think John Glenn took credit for the chapter that he begins his book is about this, because The Spy Who Loved Me was a big thing. He'd been the main editor of the Bond films. He was part of a film crew. I didn't know he was the main person. I thought the main person was Ray DuPont, who was a Canadian who was actually the production coordinator or something like that. I knew that John Glenn was the editor. I didn't know that editing, I was that naive, was involved in filmmaking from the beginning. I thought only after all the footage is assembled, the editor spends, a couple of months in a dark room putting everything together. But Rene DuPont, I thought was the key guy. Mm. And when I first got there, he said exactly what someone in my position wants to hear. He said, Rick, if you think it's dangerous, forget about the expense and everything. Don't do it. And again, that was exactly what I wanted to hear. I have to add, Rene went on to be the co-producer of a film, A Christmas Story. But again, John Glenn was actually the main, Rene was hired as one of the Canadian. I think they have a rule that 10% of the crew has to be Canadian. But John Glenn, which I didn't know at the time, was the main person from the Bond production company that was there. So anyway, his chapter, Bond films are fiction, they're fantasy, but the story of how a film is made is supposed to be fact. John's a great guy, great bloke, but when I read his chapter, and again, that film changed his career. He went from lead editor to director and directed more films than anyone else the next 5. And I understand the success of that jump, which is very important because at the time, Cubby Broccoli had just become the sole producer of the Bond films. He and Harry Saltzman co-produced, and then they had a breakup. And a lot of people thought that Cubby would not be able to do it himself. I didn't know this at the time, so this excessive, if The Spy Who Loved Me had failed financially, it may have been the end of the Bond franchise, the most successful franchise in film history. And of course, now that's threatened by the Amazon takeover. But anyway, John Glenn's account, and I think John's a great guy, but it's more fiction than fact. He said things like the crew camped out at the base of the peak. That never happened. There's a story in one of the helicopter rides back and forth. They picked up a stray husky on the glacier. That did not happen. I don't, I only have one film to remember when you're writing a memoir. He has all the films he worked on, so, that could be a factor. Anyway, the weather was bad, and I came up with the idea of, there are microclimates. We're in a place about a thing called Peyton Place, a lodge, by a former Hudson Bay Company employee, the only lodging in the settlement called Pangatung, which is the second largest settlement of Inuits, Eskimos, in Baffin Island. I said, there are microclimates. Even though it's raining here, it might be better 30 miles away where the location was. So what happened was they started sending, there'd be a morning flight of a helicopter with a passenger present to check out the weather. And then there was an afternoon flight. And this happened for a few days. And the weather was bad there as well as it was where we were lodging. And the calls were coming from London. Has he done it yet? I think it says in the book that I took those calls. I never took any of those calls. They would have joined Glenn, but I knew what was, it was a very small crew. Some people said it was more like a third unit than a second unit. And there was a certain pressure. You had it was the most expensive stunt in history. You had the Panavision cameras, which I always rented, and the cost of mounting it as days go on. And meanwhile, the Summer Olympics were happening south of us. We were among the only people in the world watching it from north in Montreal, Canada. And some of the Inuit hamlets had gotten satellite reception. Some of them voted against it. So I was a huge Olympics fan. That was my goal in wrestling. I made the Olympic trials in 1964 at the New York World's Fair. I didn't even go. It's an honor to make the trials, but I was good, but I probably wasn't good enough to make the team. But I remember I'd watch Olympics every evening, and then this drizzle turned into a hard rain, and I was supposed to be on the morning flight the next day, and it was obvious that, and I was sleepy. I'd stayed up too late watching TV until the reception was over, and I was a bit chagrined at having to get up in the morning because now the weather's the worst it's been the whole time, and I'm the passenger with the pilot. I mean, they're fantastic scenic flights. Don't get me wrong there, but it was to no avail. We flew up, and sure enough, it's bad weather up there. We fly back, and then the afternoon flight is scheduled, and it comes back, and they said we could do it. It's all cloudy and everything, but it's not precipitating, but it's clear. And the first thought that went through my mind was, what are you talking about? This is the worst weather we had yet. No way. What Renee had said to me about my life being more important, well, where did that go? So anyway, a lot of the camera gear, the tripods and so on, had been left atop Mount Asgard. A lot of the peaks are named after Nordic gods. And we get in the helicopter, and the guy wasn't kidding. It was actually all cloudy, but it was late in the day. We're going to lose the light soon. So it was a real hurry-up operation, and they did it. And when they got set up, and we did the thing, it actually provided kind of a surreal effect. It was the glacier down below was covered in clouds, and they got it by the skin of its teeth. It was so close not getting that. And I know that the next day of good weather was a week later. I stayed on because my assistant, a fellow climber, our goal was, to climb Mount Asgard. May as well, we're up there. And so I know that another week went by before the weather was good. And I don't think the crew would have stayed another week. My main point is that this scene, which became an iconic sequence in cinema, barely happened.
Wow.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Agents, where are you? Why do you hide? Follow that Patreon trail and make SpyHards your guide.
That's right. From Spy TV reviews covering the antics of George Smiley, Jack Bauer, and the Slow Horses to reviews of non-spy movies from your favorite spy actors, there's no more secrets over on our Patreon. But Cam, tell the listeners about this week's top secret broadcast.
Suffering from the summer doldrums? Well, we have the cure for you. Jump on over to the Patreon and catch up on our July offerings. I'm talking about reviews of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and Gran Torino, plus the 1989 HBO TV movie Red King, White Knight. Get them while they're hot, people.
So deactivate Ghost Protocol and visit patreon.com/spyhards to truly do things angel style.
But before we close Channel D, on with the Spy Jinx. So, I was curious, we talk about John Glenn, you do the stunt. Who are some of the, maybe under-recognized participants that helped make this happen?
Well, one, which is interesting, that the company which had sold the parachute, the Union Jack design in Southern California, they had a representative
Mm-hmm.
Who joined our crew, and after the first week, he said, "I have to go back. My time's up." Now, if I'd had to, I was such a novice skydiver that if I'd had to repack the chute uh, to do a second take, well, I know I did repack the chute, and the next time I used it was the only time I had a malfunction. I'd packed it wrong. That was how inexperienced I was. And if that had happened up there, it might have been an interesting thing that, the main parachute comes out and then I have to cut away from it and open reserve. Well, the reserve wasn't the Union Jack. It was just, I think, plain white. So it would have been a disaster. It didn't have him. The cameraman, I was impressed with the crew tremendously. You have to forgive me. I've forgotten names aside from Ray DuPont and John Glenn, but the cameraman, the spunk that they showed, even sometimes climbers, it's one thing if you climb a big rock face and then you're on the top of it, you get used to the exposure, but to suddenly be situated with this huge drop off right next to you, it's frightening. And what went through my mind is I could see why Britain won the Battle of Britain. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but that spunk of the crew, I was really impressed with them. There was one Canadian. He was the guy on the ledge directly below me. We'd get him in place, and it was only going to be a little edited-in shot. Again, the Canadians have a rule that 10% of the crew, there are 11 of us, have to be Canadian. I don't think he would have taken the assignment if he realized what it was. He's holding his wide angle. I don't. He was very worried. We had him tied in. We mentioned a modern climbing rope. Climbing ropes could be cut going over a sharp edge, but you can't exert enough force in a climbing fall to break a climbing rope. And we told this to him, and he said, "I don't care. I want 5 ropes tying me in." And that always stuck with me. But there was one other thing that was interesting. Unlike the Canadian Club ad that gave the Bond people the idea of putting this in the book, and again in the film, again it wasn't in the book. We had a reconnaissance flight, and we got up there, and there's a helicopter waiting on the landing strip, the dirt landing strip, and we flew up, and I was standing on the edge in a bright red duvet, and the chopper circled me, getting footage. And I mean, this is all rumor, what I heard. I'd heard that they decided that MGM, who has to approve the expenditures and so on, they decided that this stunt was too expensive. They decided to can it. But then because that footage of my standing on the edge was so spectacular, they changed their minds and said, "Go ahead." They gave Cubby the go ahead. He always said this was his favorite thing in any of the Bond movies that he produced. So that was another thing, how close it came to not happening. And I kept a scrapbook. One of the 2 main American magazines, I think it was, one of them said it's the greatest stunt in cinematic history. And again, I always found that, besides flattering, I found that ironic because, again, I never regard myself as a stunt man per se. The other one was Newsweek, the other was Time magazine, said, it made a pun. It said the opening scene is great, and then the rest of the movie goes downhill.
Oh.
Which gave me the idea that film was not one of the better Bond films. Since then, and again, this is subjective, reading polls, I see it ranked, The Spy Who Loved Me, in the top third of the Bond films when they have polls. And there are people, a lot of people said, Sean Connery back then, this was before Roger Craig, of course, and not Roger Craig, Daniel Craig. Roger Craig is an American football player. Um, People said, Sean Connery is the only great actor to play Bond. Roger Moore, didn't like him as much. But there are people who, Roger Moore was their favorite Bond. And even the crew, I remember once working on For Your Eyes Only, they were making remarks behind his back that, Roger Moore is not playing Bond. They changed Bond to fit Roger Moore. Well, Roger Moore's fort was repartee, so they did change the character a bit in view of what Roger's strengths as an actor was. But again, the people, Roger Moore was their favorite, actor portraying Bond.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's where I was. Grew up on Roger Moore, and he was my favorite and still remains my kind of affectionate favorite. And, we're talking there about Roger Moore, who's an actor. When you are pulling off this incredible stunt, how much are you thinking about performance? Because, you are portraying James Bond in this moment.
Well, I think what's behind your question is a famous line where John Glenn says right before, the thing is ready to happen, remember, you're James Bond.
Uh-huh.
And that's a nice little anecdote, and I think that one actually happened. But to be honest, I thought that was absurd. James Bond is a fictitious superhero character. I'm not supposed to be thinking I'm James Bond. I'm trying to save my life. I'm trying to perform the stunt and save my life.
Yeah.
What's going through the run was very short compared to the one in Yosemite. It was short and steeper. It was just about the length of a climbing rope, maybe 50 meters. And there was what we call in skiing, there was some breakable crust, which could catch a ski edge. People who are good observers of the film will notice that the snow is not pristine. I side-slipped it to make it smooth. Anyway, so what's going through my mind is I do the short ski run, I drop the ski poles, I go into space, I release the skis because they may tangle with the parachute. I get into what we call stable position, stomach to earth, and I pull the ripcord. I'm not supposed to be thinking I'm James Bond. How's that help me? So it's a very nice anecdote, but as far as giving me direction, it's really silly. Now, I don't know if you know the American magazine, The New Yorker.
Mm-hmm.
It's a weekly magazine. It's my favorite. And I've been intending to do a feature article with a catchy title, How I Blew Both My Bond Stunts. A couple of months ago, on May 5th, I actually had a letter to the editor published. That's pretty hard to achieve. It was on Henrik Ibsen, the great Norwegian playwright. When I was at Berkeley, I had a sociology major with an emphasis on demography, population studies, but I had a second major, Scandinavian language and studies. And Ibsen, the playwright, whose most famous play is A Doll's House, he's one of my great loves in literature. And I had a letter to the editor published on that subject. Anyway, the feature article that I've long endeavored to write, if I could, show the discipline, I've become very intellectually lazy of late, is How I Blew Both My Bond Stunts. And the way I blew the stunt in The Spy Who Loved Me, when you make parachute jumps, you're wearing a baggy outfit. The idea is when you've picked up some speed, usually jumping out of a helicopter, most usually a plane, you build up the air. It compresses a cushion of air beneath you. And that's why you're able to make maneuvers. But I'm not wearing, a fluffy outfit. I'm in tight ski clothing with heavy plastic ski boots. And don't forget, I'm a novice skydiver. So the problems that I had to overcome, the three jumps in Yosemite, each one I became better at, getting the parachute open the skis off, and the chute open more quickly. The first time, the reason I hit a tree and didn't make the meadow, the only suitable landing area, was because I fell too far before doing those things. The second one, the good one, was fine. The third one, I mean, I felt like I was almost level with the summit of the crag when I had those things off. And I had to circle back and forth not to overshoot the meadow. And I thought I was fine, but then I clipped this tree on the edge of the meadow. Now, a bunch of time had gone by between that and the bond sequence, and I reverted. I was having trouble. I got the skis off. People told me later it looks like one of the skis hits the parachute as deploying. And I said, no, I don't think that happened. It's just camera angle. But when I was able to see it many times, not on a big screen, but when the internet came into being, I realized they were right. It did, which makes it, one of the definitions of adventure is having a large element of the unknown. The unknown here was when you release the skis, what trajectory you're going to take and what trajectory the skis are going to take. And it really looks like one of the skis hit the parachute. But even if it had punctured, it really wouldn't make much difference. A parachute opens with tremendous velocity and force. But anyway, the main problem was that the time spent, I fell out of range of the camera in the helicopter, which was supposed to be the master shot. When I deployed the Union Jack chute, it was beyond the range of the master shot. So what happened was they're sending the film down to the film lab in Montreal, and then they'll, by satellite phone, whatever, we'll get the results. The guy, the camera again on the ledge directly below me with the wide angle, that was just for a quick edit-in shot. But the guy on the edge, whose camera followed me on the run to the edge and then into space and the deployment, he says, I think I got it. So that's what on tenterhooks we waited for the report. And they said, it's okay, it's good enough. But so I screwed up. And that's, the problems of dealing with a non-professional, you might say. But it didn't make a difference. I had 3 screw-ups on For Your Eyes Only. One of them was, we were second unit. Again, some people said we were more like third unit. Only 11 of us. I get to be like, the star of that group in Baffin Island. But in For Your Eyes Only, filming in Greece, the first unit, the actors, Roger Moore and Carol Bouquet, who played the female interest and so on, they were there for a week. As you guys know, it's very expensive to film on location. They try to do as much as they can in the studio, but they felt there were things that, you needed the main actors to be on location. Jaime Topol, the great Israeli actor, played Fiddler on the Roof. So there's a scene where Roger, who is a skier but not a climber, he has to tie into the knot. And there are 2 different knots used to tie in a climbing rope. One is the knot that every Boy Scout learns, which I'm having a brain fade for a second thinking of. Oh, the bowline. The bowline. The other's called a figure of 8. I gave him the bowline, and we practiced, and I thought he had it down, but he didn't. And in the end, if you look at the film closely, he just pretends like he's trying, he tucks his sweater over it. Well, it struck me afterwards. I gave him the harder of the 2 knots. To me, they were equal. I've been doing this for years. The figure of 8, which most climbers use today, is much simpler. So, and he said, he was very kind. He said, I was his mentor. He said, I made you look bad. No, it was the reverse. I made him look bad. Again, but no one's going to notice.
Right.
One of the other 2 mistakes was when I got into climbing, ropes had only 3 colors. They were white, red, or blue. They're very drab. And then there was an explosion when they went through all these crazy designs of the outer sheath. The one I remember most was called, and had a very colorful name, Hollywood Rattlesnake. So I was the one who was to choose the rope colors. And I got a bunch of was it blue? To me, that was very drab compared to things like these really neat designs. To me, it was drab. But was it? Did I buy a bunch of blue, a bunch of red? But I completely spaced out on. It's still maybe it was red. It may not be a fancy design, but it's a bright color. He's supposed to be climbing this cliff surreptitiously. You want something that's going to blend in a dark color with the rock. So that was my second screw up. The third one was, and again, the problem of dealing with non-professionals, pseudo stunt people. My screen direction, when he takes that huge fall, he's supposed to not move, like he's stunned. When I completely forgot that, I was so happy it worked. I'd never done a fall except, maybe 10 feet long, a very conservative, you may say chicken, but I was very proud of that in my career. When I got to the bottom, I was gesticulating somewhat. Hey, it worked, I'm alive. And then I remembered, oh no, I'm supposed to go limp. So then I went limp, but the idea was I was supposed to initially not move, like I was completely stunned, and then start doing things to climb back up the rope. So again, I actually screwed up in 3 different ways, which did not matter. But as you could tell, it's still in my mind.
I don't think anyone who considers himself a Bond fan is really holding it against you, any of those mistakes. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. I'm curious about one element you mentioned with the ski jump, which is the cameras not catching the shot. Apart from the one who did get it, and the rest is history. One thing that strikes me about it is, you were up against it. There was people from London saying, you've got to get it or you've got to cut it. Like it's either going to happen or it's not. And this is a big if that other camera hadn't have got the shot, and once it gone to Montreal and you found out maybe they hadn't got it, would you have been willing to go back up there and do it again?
Oh yeah, I think we've already established that. I'm a complete idiot. I think the 3 of us could agree on that. Plus, who's ever watching this later? No. What happened was, and this is again how close it came to not happening. First of all, I lost the guy who worked for the company that had designed the parachute. His time was up. He had to go back to work. Mm-hmm. So to repack the parachute, which I did, assuming there was time for a second jump, I packed it wrong. I had the only malfunction in my life. There's a tradition at jump centers when you see the reserve parachute can't be packed. It has to be packed by a licensed rigger, and they have to be periodically. It's crammed together in the pack, and occasionally you have to let them air out and breathe and be repacked. They have a little pouch you write the date. It's kind of like when you get in an elevator. Sometimes you see the last time they have to be checked regularly, and so we're talking about the reserve chute now. I repacked the main chute, and the next time I used it at a skydiving center close to where the chute was manufactured, was sewn, I had my only malfunction in my short little skydiving career. I'd packed it wrong. So let's say there was time for a second take up there. It would have not been the Union Jack that came out. That came out all tangled up. When you have a malfunction like that, you cut away from the main chute, and then you pull the ripcord on the reserve chute. So that's the first thing that would have been bad, because again, the reserve chute was just it wasn't the Union Jack. It was just pure white. It would have been interesting that happened, but I mean, when I do interviews with Brits, there's an aspect of this whole thing I always forget, and that's the the patriotic bit. British audiences, more than general audiences across the planet, love that scene, the Union Jack coming out. I think I could take credit that this is why they had them parachuting into the stadium as part of the opening ceremonies for the London Olympics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure. I mean, I bet money it was based on the Bond film happening. The second thing was there was no time. We got the last light of the day for that shot. It couldn't have been quick. Well, take you back to pack the chute on the glacier at the base of Mount Asgard. We'll chop it back to the top and do it again. No, the light was gone. And then the bad weather came in and lasted another week. So it came so close to not happening. I mean, if you want to, get spacey, you could say it was destined to happen. There's another aspect which I've always thought about. It's almost a rule of cinema trying to seek out the most spectacular locations of the world. Mount Asgard is actually a twin peak. There's a north tower and a south tower. But what's really spectacular is when you have one of them behind the other, and it just looks like one. It looks like a glass upside down. Well, you couldn't portray that. You couldn't have a wide angle, even though this thing is so freaking spectacular. You couldn't have a long shot because that wouldn't make sense to the plot. The plot was he's in that cabin, and then he starts skiing, and the ski chase happens, which I did not do. That was done months later in the Italian Alps, is my understanding. If this thing is on top of a little rock pinnacle, how could you have that ski chase? So they could never do a long shot of the spectacular rock formation showing that. I always thought that was a shame, but it wouldn't make sense with the script if they'd done that. I mean, you hear about footage that ends up on the cutting room floor. This is footage that never, got made.
So, Rick, you've shot the stunt on The Spy Who Loved Me, and this is part of the second unit. You affectionately called it the third unit, but is that your involvement with The Spy Who Loved Me done? Was there anything after that?
Well, it wasn't my term. Someone said we were so remote, 11 people, including a doctor. I thought an undertaker would have been more apropos. That he already said you're almost a third unit, a term which of course doesn't exist. But what happened afterwards, I don't know if over there you have the same term as we have here, sneak preview. Is that what you do?
Yeah.
So Cubby invited me to a sneak preview, of The Spy Who Loved Me. And my mother accompanied me. It was at a theater in Westwood next to the UCLA campus, and which I'd gone to as a youth. And what was on the marquee was a Woody Allen film. And I'm a huge Woody Allen fan, despite what's happened the last few years. The Woody Allen film, which is also released by United Artists, so that made sense, was on the marquee. So we're sitting next to Cubby and another man, and again, I wish I'd taken notes. It may have been Charles, I had it a second ago, a writer that just faded, Mankiewicz. Cubby, my mother and I are sitting in the second to last row of the theater. They're there to judge audience interest and so on, and audience reaction. And so my scene comes on about 4 minutes into the film after the submarines stuff and just before the credits. And there are 2 women chatting behind us on last row. And the ski base jump happens. And one of them turns to a companion and says, "How do they do that?" The true story. And her companion says, "Oh, they use dummies." And my wife, my mother swivels in her seat and says, "Yes, my son, the dummy." True story. She's a Jewish mother. She would have preferred to, be a doctor, of course.
Of course, sure.
So then, I stayed for the Woody Allen film, which I relate a lot more to Woody Allen than James Bond. But anyway, since I was in theater, I stayed for that. And anyway, that's my little anecdote.
It's just testament, I think, to the almost impossibility of that parachute jump. Like you feel like it shouldn't happen. I remember once I went. Well, I've been to the Grand Canyon many times, but the first time I went to the Grand Canyon, I walked out into the chasm, and you look down, and you just think that it looks like it's been computer generated. Like something like that couldn't exist in nature. As I almost feel for that woman in the audience there, like, oh, it's fake, but no, you made it happen. It was very real.
Well, we live on a planet that has so much beauty, natural beauty, and what nature's done. Even though mankind, I've never been as interested in man-made sculptures as what nature's done. But it's funny. You watch the state of the art with skiing now. I mean, where they do I can't even count them, where they do all these amazing twists and things. My thing is just like kindergarten compared to that. But and all the ski movies that are produced, and just this amazing flips and so on. My thing is really straightforward compared to that. But when I see it, it holds up, and I think there are two reasons for that. One, it's set in 70 millimeter Panavision, which these other films are not, of course. Prohibitively expensive it would be. And the other is the setting, the backdrop up there on Baffin Island, which is, one of the most spectacular places on the planet. The Arctic is either seems to be absolutely flat or completely vertical, all these incredible cliffs, that rise up. So I'm always amazed that again, maybe I'm not being objective because I was involved, but it holds up, even though I was very proud compared to for once I had good form when it really counted, when it's something that's seen by millions rather than the El Cap jumps. But there's no twists and twists. It's just a guy going off straight, and but it still looks good. So what the heck?
Holy moly, that was Rick Sylvester, part 1?
That's right, because of course he worked on For Your Eyes Only, and, there was obviously a lot of detail in terms of that account as to how that parachute jump actually happened. And so guess what? You're going to have to come back later in the week to hear all the stories about how the For Your Eyes Only cliff fall happened.
Yeah, much like a cliffhanger itself, we thought we'd leave you waiting, wanting more. But also, we did this earlier in the year with another interview that went quite long. I mean, before it broke down, this interview came in at 2.5 hours. We had really great feedback about doing this last time, so we cut it in half, putting it out on Tuesday and Friday. So part 2 of our Rick Sylvester interview is coming this Friday. And if you're listening to this in the future, both of them are out already, so just click onto that one and enjoy. But for the For Your Eyes Only stories, tune back in on Friday.
Yeah, and a lot of postscript stuff as well in part 2 as well. That's just really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, just talking about the experience of interviewing Rick, I mean, at the time of doing this, we tend to record our interviews quite far in advance. This was the first time he'd ever done a podcast, and clearly a pro at it. And like so much so that he called me after doing this and said, I've actually got a few more stories I forgot to tell you. So I went back on with him for another hour. And some of those stories ended up making it into this, so we've cut them in where we could. Hopefully you can't tell where the themes are. But yeah, like, Rick is so proud of what he did. It's clear in what you just listened to. And yeah, I think his influence in James Bond history will go on for many, many decades. And I just hope that us having this conversation will keep his name in people's thoughts, because obviously that wasn't Roger Moore.
Right. Yeah, and also just very humble as well.
Yeah.
Because as he talks about, like, he doesn't really classify himself as a stuntman, because he's not trained in the way of, stunts the way that, working professional stuntmen are. He was, he had the tools and the skills to pull off this parachute jump, and, the stunt we'll talk about in the episode to come, but this was kind of his specialty, and it's not something that was applicable to, okay, come back in View to a Kill and do the stunt driving, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, he wasn't part of that sort of cabal of stuntmen that sort of did most of the Bond films from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. He was in this film, and then through some machinations came back in For Your Eyes Only, which we'll talk about on Friday. So I think, we'll leave it there. I'm partly blown away that we've managed to get Rick on the show. I think what I love about doing these SpyMaster interviews is getting to preserve the stories of the people that made the films that we all know and love.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes me send the countless amount of emails out to see if I can get a yes. For every 100 no's I get, I'll get one yes. And we're very fortunate with the 4 that we've had for The Spy Who Loved Me.
Yeah, 100%. And just thanks to everyone as well who listened, and also to the participants in those interviews who took the time to talk to us.
Yeah, and so if you want to help support the show, I mean, if you see a post of ours online, retweet it, repost it, do whatever you need to do, or just post about it yourself. If you enjoyed this interview, let everyone else know. Post about it on social media. Say, hey, check out this interview. You'll be doing us a favor, and it's completely free.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can't ask for much, but we ask for that. So your mission, of course, folks, is to tune in this Friday to hear part 2 of our interview with Mr. Rick Sylvester. As I said, if you want to support the show, talk about us online, engage with us online, and post about the show wherever you are doing your social medias. And if you aren't already following us, come and find us at SpyHards. That's SpyHards, wherever you do that. But until next time, Cam, remember, you are not James Bond.